Dr. Facilier may have had friends on the other side, but not much is known about his life on the earthly plane. Seeing how he has become a fan favorite character among the massive roster of Disney villains, one might think that there's more information out there surrounding his backstory, but in reality, there is only what the creators have said about his character. However, if you were to combine his character design with the real history of New Orleans and voodoo, there are actually some really interesting concepts for his origin. And believe it or not, these theories or concepts not only explain his motives in the movie, but also reveal some unsettling details about New Orleans. While he may have been a powerful man when he was assisted by his friends on the other side, Dr. Facilier wasn't always so powerful, and there's no doubt that his depressing upbringing had a lot of impact on his villainous ways. You see, though no one other than the creators of Princess and the Frog can be certain about Facilier's origin, judging by the time period that the movie was set in, there's a good chance things weren't exactly easy for him. Princess and the Frog was set in 1926, and though he wasn't given an exact age, it's safe to presume that Dr. Facilier was born sometime between 1880 and 1895, if you want a generous margin. And it's likely that Facilier grew up with little to no money in his pocket, which may have led him to live an unhappy life, always watching the rich people of the city like Eli LaBeouf, aka Big Daddy, the most powerful man in New Orleans, in awe and envy. It's no surprise that it might have become too much for Facilier to put up with anymore, and he turned to the dark side of voodoo to get the power that he likely felt he deserved. Honestly, his story probably goes a bit deeper than that though. In order to really find out why Dr. Facilier was so obsessed with becoming the most powerful person in New Orleans and taking it over, it's important to understand the inspiration behind his character as well as some history about New Orleans. And this might actually explain where Dr. Facilier came from and what his true origin story was, and why his tragic upbringing led him to hate the rich and want to rule New Orleans with a voodoo fist. Now, New Orleans was obviously Disneyfied in The Princess and the Frog, because the reality of life there in the late 19th century and early 20th century may have been great for some, but that wasn't the case for most people living there, especially if you weren't white. A lot of the time you'll hear stories about the prosperous black people who came from or resided in New Orleans, such as Tommy LaFawn, who, in 1870, became the richest black person in the US. But there were a lot of tragic incidents for non-white people in the city throughout history, some of which Dr. Facilier likely lived through and experienced firsthand, which would have caused his life to be far more tragic than the Disney movie led on. It could also explain his drive to rule New Orleans and make some changes to the city. Now, this isn't to say that New Orleans wasn't progressively advanced for its time, especially with the fact that public schools, which, according to historical reports, were integrated to varying degrees in the 1800s, but it still wasn't without its problems, like the 1866 massacre, a horrific tragedy that involved the death of multiple black citizens who were killed by mobs of white people simply for demanding democratic participation. If we are going off his supposed birth year, Facilier was born shortly after times like these, so to think that he wouldn't have faced any prejudice growing up would be almost foolish. In fact, there's a chance that his life was filled with people prejudging him, whether it was because he wasn't a part of the upper class or because of the color of his skin. And that could have been why he decided to follow the Dark Loa, which will come up more in a minute, to make a change in not only his life, but in the lives of those around him. Only, instead of helping people, he used his silver tongue to con the rich out of their wealth, while slowly working his way towards his master plan of becoming the most powerful man in New Orleans. You can also find out a lot about Dr. Facilier and understand him on a deeper level when you take a look at the actual voodoo figures who inspired his character design. When it came to the creation of Dr. Facilier, the character designers wanted his appearance to show that he had given himself over to the darker side of voodoo and was working with the evil Loa. For those who don't know, in voodoo lore, the Loa are the spirits that assist those who study the arts. Like most spiritual beings, the Loa are often depicted as either good or evil, and Dr. Facilier actually based his look on one of the darkest Loa of all time. This indicates that the character gave himself over to the dark spirits in order to pursue his goal, and it's really sad to think that it was because of his tragic upbringing. In Disney's Princess and the Frog, Dr. Facilier's outfit was based on the depictions of Baron Samedi, the Loa of the dead. Baron has famously been portrayed wearing a top hat along with a black tailcoat, much like the Voodoo Doctor in the animated Disney classic. And that could be their way of implying that when he had the opportunity to work with or make a deal with the Loa, he decided it would be more lucrative for him to work with the evil spirits because they could help him get revenge for his troubled life. With all of that in mind, there was actually a really interesting theory on Reddit about Dr. Facilier's origin that can be expanded on that could prove that it was his tragic backstory that led him down such a dark and destructive path to becoming the king of New Orleans. You see, according to this theory, and much as his character in Princess and the Frog would suggest, Facilier didn't grow up in a rich home. In fact, it was the opposite. Much like Tiana's family was shown doing at the beginning of the movie, Facilier's family likely lived in a small shack and worked constantly to make ends meet. This meant catering to the rich and doing any odd jobs that would come his way, no matter how poorly it resulted in Facilier being treated. But despite how tough that would have been, that's not the tragedy that would lead him down such a dark path. Although it would say something about the true history of New Orleans and the distance in social standing between the white and black people during that time period. According to this theory, Facilier's tragic life truly began after a brief period of happiness. Facilier had managed to find love in an otherwise cruel world, and with that love, the theory claims that he started a family. Sadly, their life together wasn't all rainbows and sunshine, and the future villain would soon face a heartbreak that he never expected. The theory continued by explaining that his wife, though they were happy together, mysteriously left him after being overcome by a sudden illness. It was just out of the blue, and left Facilier in shambles for multiple reasons. For one, the love of his life had just left him according to this theory. And on the other hand, if the illness was genetic, he had to worry about his child getting it, and it was this combination of tragedy and fear that led Facilier to the dark side of the voodoo arts, at least according to the theory. Little did he know that this interaction would lead him down a slippery slope that directly caused him to want to control all of New Orleans, which would be a huge step from wanting to simply save his family. It's believed by the person who originally created this theory that Facilier went to consult his mother-in-law, who happened to be an expert in the art of voodoo, only she practiced the beautiful side of the mystic arts. That's right, according to this theory, Facilier's mother-in-law was none other than Mama Odie herself, and though she surely would have loved to help him bring her daughter back to them, she actually advised him against it. Seeing how she was well versed in the art of voodoo, Mama Odie would have been well aware of the risks that came from working with the Dark Loa, so the theory claims she reluctantly warned him not to answer their call. Facilier didn't listen though, and instead, he ended up making an offer to the Loa that he couldn't possibly keep, an offer that led him into pursuing such a dark path with the goal of controlling the city that once made his life miserable simply because of his class and the color of his skin. According to the theory, Dr. Facilier offered his friends on the other side control over New Orleans for themselves as long as they helped him keep his children safe from the illness that took their mother away from him. And though the Loa accepted the deal, when the time came to pay up, there was no way that Facilier was going to be able to repay a debt that was literally the size of a city. But because of how much he truly hated the people in the city, especially the rich upper class who ruled it, he had no problem using his dark powers to ruin the lives of countless people in the city. And according to the theory, he did so in hopes of becoming powerful enough to actually take the city. Dr. Facilier thought he actually had a good opportunity to do that when Naveen arrived. Though, as Disney's Princess and the Frog showed at the end of the movie, that didn't quite work out for him, and the Loa were tired of waiting, so they decided to take his soul as payment instead of the city. What do you think though? What in Dr. Facilier's upbringing caused him to turn into such a conniving villain that was obsessed with ruling over New Orleans? Make sure you let us know what you think in the comments down below.